And now the President of the University, Lee C. Bollinger.
It is my very, very great pleasure to say, on behalf of the trustees and the faculty of Columbia University, congratulations to all of the classes of 2009. This event, this graduation ceremony in this glorious space on this magnificent day is both exhilarating and humbling. There is no other occasion I can think of that has a greater purity of happiness and goodwill than this one. The concentration of joy and well-deserved satisfaction contained by the walls of these buildings, which bespeak an intellectual life, is as potent a force as exists in the universe. More happiness per square inch than we are ever likely to see again. Years of mental labor and toil have brought you to this moment, and marking this intellectual milestone is our happy and simple mission for the day, and I am honored to share this with you. Standing on these steps, I cannot help but recall several other memorable and moving moments this past year when students, faculty, and staff came together here in what has come to be regarded as Columbia's town square. On these steps, this past September 11th, we stood together in memory of those who lost their lives 8 years earlier, and to listen to presidential candidates John McCain and Barack Obama who had come to this campus to talk about one of Columbia's defining values, service to our neighbors, our nation, and the world. Then, on these steps, on January 20th, we stood as one to witness the inauguration of the first Columbia graduate and the first African-American president of the United States. And on these steps, on far too few balmy days this cold, damp spring, you have sat with friends and classmates to share both some occasional sunshine and some part of yourselves, an ageless form of connection that still beats updating your Facebook page. Now on these steps, and all the way back to Butler Library, we assemble once again, for many of you, the last time, to share the exhilaration of today's commencement, and to feel humbled. For today marks an ending as well as a beginning. You have succeeded here, but now you have new goals to imagine and pursue. It's humbling to realize that the quest never ends. And then there's the strange fact that the more we learn, the more we become aware of how much we don't know. Knowledge makes us feel ignorant, and that's humbling. And finally, this is a time to take stock of the fact that you did none of this alone. You have benefited from countless people as you have set your aspirations, struggled to overcome life's disappointments, and celebrated your successes. This is a good moment, then, to welcome and specifically to thank the parents, the grandparents, the families, and friends of the graduates. On behalf of all of us at Columbia, we want to thank you for letting us have the pleasure of teaching your children, to learn from them and to be inspired by their hopes and dreams for the future. We share your pride in them. We know that many of you have made great sacrifices to get to this day. Your love, support, and faith in your graduates has given them the courage to undertake the greatest educational venture of their lives. And so before we go any further, let's give this opportunity to the graduates to thank the people who truly made this day possible, your parents and families. Commencement is a time to imagine the future. And for those of us here today who are older than you, we know all too well that the future seems to have its own way of unfolding, often very differently than we anticipated. But we still should take advantage of this grand occasion to step back and take a large and long view of what service we need to render to the world we now inherit and will hand over to generations who will follow you. Your lives will stretch across this new century. And today we can stand on your young shoulders, and in doing so, perhaps peer further into what lies ahead. For me, living in one of the greatest universities in the world, so committed to understanding the world in all its complexity, and having spent my own life thinking about the great principles of freedom of speech and press, I find myself increasingly concerned about the need to secure and to realize these freedoms on a global scale in the increasingly interdependent, emerging global society that will, in all probability, define the span of your lives. This is a matter of deep and abiding importance to this class, not least because you have been here at a pivotal moment in history. You came in texting, and you're going out with a Twitter. And by the way, there is an impersonator of me on the Twitter I'm following. And regardless of whether you're a fan of digital downloads or old-fashioned ink on paper, while you've been here, you have seen the value of dialogue and of access to timely, credible, independently generated information and ideas. In August 2005, just as many of you were settling into your first semester here, Hurricane Katrina was ravaging the city of New Orleans amid accusations of gross government mismanagement and misinformation. Your Columbia years have coincided with two brutal and still unfinished wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, shaped by our own government's far too extensive control over information. You will tell your children about the unprecedented economic crisis that erupted during your time here, a global event fueled by inadequate disclosures and regulation. From the standpoint of our ability to acquire a full understanding of things that matter, we clearly have a long way to go before we can rest. Meanwhile, you have been witness to and strengthened by participating in the process of vigorous open debate on issues such as gay marriage, conflict in the Middle East, and climate change. And you have played a role in one of the most exciting political campaigns in American history, a campaign waged like never before through online media and social networking. going to hear from them a lot, actually. Through it all, you have lived in the most privileged intellectual environment on the planet and perhaps of all time. Nothing compares to this, to the freedoms that you have felt and possibly taken for granted. The freedom to consider every idea and to hear every speaker imaginable, and I mean every speaker. As a society, we have long depended on two major institutions, our universities and the press, to be champions for and practitioners of the principle of freedom of expression. Each in its own way serves the public good. Each offers its own kind of syllabus for good citizenship, and each is emblematic of our larger responsibility to answer bad ideas with better ideas, not to hide or be silent. As a result, you have had that all too rare human experience of thinking, listening, and speaking without fear or threat of the censor's lash. America is radical among nations in this tradition, the most committed to free speech and free press of any country ever. In the stirring language of the Supreme Court's famous 1964 decision, New York Times versus Sullivan, we have put our faith in a system that is, quote, uninhibited, robust, and wide open. But it was not always so in our country. Indeed, it has been so for less than a century. Around the time of World War I, Congress could and did make it a crime to speak or publish anything that was, quote, disloyal or scurrilous or could cause contempt or scorn for the United States, the Constitution, the flag, or the military. And on this campus, President Nicholas Murray Butler comfortably informed the Columbia community that all vocal opposition to the war would be grounds for dismissal. Our judiciary at first found no conflict between these laws and the First Amendment, but then over the course of the next several decades, it cleared away the brush and the tangled vines of censorship to give us the vista of freedom we have today. Our government acted affirmatively in many ways to do the same. Protection of state secrets, laws against speech deemed dangerous and offensive, and laws favoring reputation over free expression all had to give way to a freer and more open society. This served a country that was remaking itself. We moved from a collection of individual states with local jurisdiction to deal with local problems to a national society able and compelled to face up to increasingly national problems. As a society, we became more inclusive and pluralistic, making dialogue an even greater necessity. And our means of communication expanded. And we had the good sense to know that we had to create and fortify a national public forum protected against the chilling effects of local laws or censorship. And collectively, we bet our future on a simple proposition, that people behave better when they know more. Many, many people and many institutions over the last century made it possible for you and for us together to experience the unfettered freedom of thought, speech, and publication during your years here at Columbia. The question now before us is both simple and profound. Namely, how do we do this on a global scale for an emerging global society in this new century? To create a global public forum that is uninhibited, robust, and wide open. And this task falls squarely on your generation. And since Columbia aims to exemplify these values, it falls squarely on you. This idea of a global public forum arises out of the extraordinary integration of the world that has been accelerating during the years that you've been here. What we now call globalization is mostly a matter of increased trade in goods and services through the opening of markets around the world. It is also through increased contact, through travel, internationalization of education, and new technologies like the Internet. And it is also a matter of the rise of common global problems, of degradation of the environment and wars and disease. For both good and ill, globalization is the defining phenomenon of the era, and it promises to be so even more in the future. Meanwhile, we do not have the public institutions to make this global integration work very well, as we have discovered with the recent global financial crisis. But an even more fundamental fact is that we do not have the information and exchange of ideas we need to build the public institutions and to devise the policies to make this work. What's more, the very same technology, the Internet, that is making global communication so pervasive is simultaneously undermining the financial model of the traditional press as we've known it. Ironically and unfortunately, at the very moment when we want and need more serious study of and reporting on global issues, we are getting less and less of it. The press are closing foreign bureaus and decreasing coverage of international news. This is, and also cutting jobs. So, this is in addition to the observable and regrettable regression in some of the media into triviality, popular obsessions, and intolerant and shallow opinion mongering. No one should take this development lightly. As Walter Lippmann wrote about the shortcomings of the press in its coverage of the First World War, a crisis in journalism is a crisis in democracy. And no one should assume that the institutions committed to a professional culture of journalism or scholarship can be replaced by thousands of individual journalists, just as you cannot replace our great universities with multiple individual websites, each offering specialized knowledge in an atomized way. Next week, under the dome behind me, we will give a Pulitzer Prize for a deeply researched newspaper report on how the Pentagon successfully pitched its Iraq spin to many of the former generals who often appear as military experts in the news. It is unlikely that the lone blogger could have had the wherewithal to get and publish that story. It is also a fact that we can no longer expect the free market to produce institutions that actually play a quasi-public role, as universities do, or the press as the fourth branch of government. Eventually, there will have to be new sources of funding for the press, other than the private market. For now, oddly, a significant part of our world news comes through the BBC, and therefore courtesy of the British citizens. Meanwhile, other government-supported broadcasters from China's CCTV to Al Jazeera English are developing their own global presence. We have yet to realize that we will need to compete for ideas in the global marketplace of ideas. We must also face the harsh reality that much of the rest of the world does not take the same view of freedom of speech and press that we now do. Many countries forbid discussion about topics deemed too sensitive or dangerous. Media are strictly controlled by the state, with no allowance for private or independent press. Transmitters block signals coming from other countries, and internet portals are configured to reject messages coming into or leaving their country. Reporters are denied access to newsworthy events or people. They are put in jail on trumped-up charges, or they are subjected to unofficial violence tacitly encouraged or condoned by hostile governments. But the state of censorship in the world today is in many ways not unlike it was here. in this country just a century ago. And it changed through the dedication of many and the time of a few generations. What can be done about this now? There are many things, actually, far too many for this address, but I would suggest just a few. The first and by far the most important is that we need to begin to see this as a goal. Nothing ever really begins to change until people start to think differently, until people embrace a new paradigm. There have always been, and there are today, many people concerned about promoting human rights, including freedom of speech and press around the world. For these efforts, we are thankful. But given the growing interdependence and integration of the world through globalization, this is no longer just a matter of human rights, but a very practical need for information and ideas by which to develop the institutions and policies to make the world a better place. The message we must convey to other countries is we cannot have an economic relationship unless we also have an openness to information and ideas that is ultimately the foundation of a true relationship. And given that we now live in a world in which censorship in one country can lead to inhibiting speech everywhere, just as the court recognized in this country in Sullivan, we can no longer afford to view local censorship as having purely local consequences. We must see the foreign press as our press too, for it is from them that much of our information will ultimately derive. When journalists and scholars languish in prison, when websites are banned and signals blocked, the rights of all of us are now abridged. Finally, we need to make ourselves an even better example for the world. President Franklin Roosevelt said some years after he left this university without quite making it to where you are today, "If the fires of freedom and civil liberties burn low in other lands," he said, "they must be made brighter in our own. If in other lands press and books and literature of all kinds are censored, we must redouble our own efforts here to keep them free. If in other lands the eternal truths of the past are threatened by intolerance, we must provide a safe place for their perpetuation. This is why today we need to ensure that the press has full and unfettered access to war zones to report on where we are sending our young men and women to fight. Not embedded, but present as of right. We need to provide more funding for our system of public broadcasting and entrust it with the mission of reporting to and reporting from the global arena, especially where the news media can no longer afford to go. We need to become more committed as a nation to the development of international law governing these matters. And we need to integrate more than we do now in every field of study, in the universities and in every center of policymaking, a sense of how vital it is to everything we want to do, that there be freedom of thought, speech, and press that we have come to enjoy and hopefully not taken for granted here at Columbia. As our Attorney General of the United States told those of you at the college yesterday, this graduation may seem a culmination, but it is just the beginning of new responsibilities of citizenship. Just when you thought you were done with your finals and papers, here is a new and even more challenging task: living a life and helping to build a world in which ideas matter, knowledge can be pursued freely, dissent can be heard, and objective news can be gathered and published. That is a worthy assignment for all of you, and I'm proud to add, you are worthy of it. My greatest hope for all of you is that you will find some such mission to which you can dedicate your amazing talents and goodwill, and in doing so, fulfill the deeper ambition and purpose of the knowledge and understanding we cherish here, and that exists to a degree unparalleled in the world today. On behalf of all of us at Columbia, we congratulate you on this magnificent milestone in your lives, send you forth with optimism at the good you can now accomplish, and look forward to your saying in the future. And it was on these steps, on May the 20th, 2009, that I received my degree from Columbia. Congratulations and good luck.